Assassin's Creed Origins, released in 2017, is a game that should be looked to as a shining example of how to create an immersive open world. The game takes place in Egypt in the year 49 BC, during the reign of Julius Caesar and the boy pharaoh Ptolemy. This is one of my personal favorite times in history, as it is the climax of Caesar's reign and Rome's change from a republic to an empire. Through the events of the main story, the player is actually able to take part in many of the historical events that took place. In order to do so, they had to recreate the land of Egypt as it was in 49 BC, and this is where the game truly shines. The setting of Assassin's Creed Origins is the definition of a living world in a video game. The player can travel from city to city through the diverse landscapes found in Egypt. When we think of Egypt, many of us picture lots of sand and some dusty old pyramids. But 2,075 years ago, it was a very different place. The water levels were much higher, the land was less colonized, and the wildlife was untamed. This culminates in a much more lush, green, and wild environment than many of us think of Egypt. Part of what makes the populated areas in Origins such good examples of realistic locations is the fact that the settlements in this game are based on actual places that existed in our world. The devs tried to make these settlements as realistic as possible. In other words, by striving to create a historically accurate world, they are creating a realistic and immersive game world. As we begin the dissection of their formula for the cities and towns, I'm going to split them into several categories that we can cover one by one. Each town is constructed of several pieces, and these are the buildings, the architecture itself, the terrain, the land immediately surrounding the buildings, the civilian population here, all of the workers, laborers, nobles, priests, guards, all of them. The animals, including the livestock and the wild untamed animals, and finally, the military and religious presence. When exploring the civilized areas in Assassin's Creed Origins, one of the first things a player might notice is the varied architecture. Not only in the notable design differences between temples, residential areas, and garrisons, but also in the various cultures we can see expressed through the architecture. There is a distinct difference between the three biggest cultures in Egypt at this time, those being the Egyptians themselves, then the Greeks, and then the Romans. First is the Egyptians. We can see the architectural differences best in places like Nessos. This town is an interesting case because it is split between Egyptians and Greeks. We can see the older, more Egyptian architecture, mainly consisting of sandstone or clay bricks, dusty colored and topped with thatch or cloth roofs. These houses' design seems to be purely utilitarian, made with local ingredients, clay, thatch, and sandstone, open on many sides to allow better heat regulation throughout the building. While they may appear cheaper, and they probably are, they are simple and likely more easily constructed. In stark contrast with this, in the same town we can see the Greek architecture, white buildings of marble or painted clay bricks, often painted in various colors to imbue the basic structures with more beauty. They have what is called imbrex and tegula roofs, basically long lines of overlapping tiles to allow rainwater to wash off the roofs. Greek architecture also has many more pillars. Many of us probably learned about this in school with the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian pillars, which still have heavy influence over more modern architecture like churches and state buildings. The point is, Greek architecture is shown to be a thing of art and beauty, whereas the Egyptians' residential architecture is more representative of utility and convenience over aesthetics. Now, before someone might be offended on behalf of the Egyptian architecture, we must remember I'm not talking about the Old Kingdom, like the pyramids and the massive temples, but the residential areas for the common people. And when your life is a daily struggle against the elements, wildlife, and other people in close proximity, utility over beauty is probably a better choice. The distinction between these two styles is represented very well in the town of Nessos. From a simple aesthetic decision like this, the world becomes much more immersive and fleshed out. Cultures develop architecture. What is culture but the peoples of an area passing down their way of doing things for generations? As an Egyptian child, you'd probably see and help build buildings. They have a certain way of doing it. You would learn from a young age the way to build buildings and the basic framework and materials that would entail. Just like here in America, if you asked an average person how to build a house, they'd probably mention how we use cinder blocks, 2x4s, and drywall. The people of Egypt would be aware of what materials, shapes, and designs worked best for what is available and known to them. For the Greeks, it is the same. They have their cultures and the architecture that goes along with it. If a group of Greeks was to move to Egypt, they'd want to carry that culture with them. By creating Greek buildings for their population, they are bringing a piece of their home to this land. There is a harshness to the Greek architecture on the Egyptian landscape, whereas the colors and materials of the Egyptian homes almost blend with the surrounding lands. The Greek is much more noticeable as its colors, shapes, and size are distinctly foreign to the land it is built on. It's amazing to see this portrayed simply through the appearance of buildings in an average town in Assassin's Creed Origins. Just in the appearance of the houses in any given town, it tells a story about the people that live here. Now, I only have a rudimentary knowledge of architectural styles, and to me, Greek and Roman architecture is pretty much identical. Since Rome has very Greek influences in every aspect of its culture, architecture, and even its pantheon, this makes sense. I mean, Greco-Roman is a common nomenclature for a reason, especially at this time where these cultures had much more in common than in later centuries. I'd instead point to one of the most notable Roman styles in the game, that being in their forts rather than in their cities. Since the Roman Empire was the greatest military force in the ancient world, it's no wonder that their military bases would have been top-notch. We can see this architectural dichotomy very well when comparing an Egyptian fort to a Roman citadel. Once again, the Egyptian architecture shares qualities with the land surrounding it. Being made again of either sandstone or clay bricks, it has a dusty tan appearance. The rooftops again being primarily thatch or cloth further this similarity. Again, the Egyptian architecture simply feels more local, and rightly so. In harsh contrast to this is the Roman citadel. This fort sticks out like a sore thumb. Rather than appearing to be built from the land around it, it feels distinctly oppressive and foreign to the surrounding area. A beacon that channels the power and might of this empire. The foreground is filled with scorpion artillery and catapults. The tile roofs atop the pale towers of stone. Once again, purely in the architecture of these locations, the game is able to convey so much history. This is environmental storytelling at its finest. Being able to clearly communicate a culture through the architecture of a building is difficult to pull off for most games. The only other game off the top of my head I can think of that does this well would be Morrowind, with its different Dark Elf houses and Imperial outposts. We have seen how well it was done in Assassin's Creed Origins. I hope that this trend towards realistic depictions of building diversity continues to improve with RPGs in the future. If game designers focused on their world design over monetization schemes and DLC, gaming would take a step away from being a business and back towards an art form. Now, enough about the architecture. Let's discuss the land itself. Specifically, the land immediately surrounding the towns and cities of Assassin's Creed Origins. I'll spoil my reason for this topic right off the bat. We are going to be looking at the farms. All too often in games, it seems the devs have their priorities backwards in the design of their settlements and towns. It seems to me that they create a town to their specifications and then place it on the map after the fact. I would argue they should find or design a place in the map that has the resources to support that settlement before designing the town itself. That way, the scale and layout of the town is a product of its environment, rather than a population existing in an area that lacks both strategic and agricultural resources to be able to support a town's worth of people. The towns of Assassin's Creed Origins do this very well. If you encircled the area that would be considered the entirety of any given town, you'll find that usually 30 to 60% of that area is dedicated to resource collection rather than housing or military structures. We see farms, fishing areas, locations dedicated to certain trades, material processing, and other things. These resources would be the real reason that town exists there in the first place. And given that fact, those resources and how they are collected should take priority in a town's design. To create more immersive worlds, the game should communicate the reasons people are where they are and doing what they are doing. This should be communicated from the first moment a player lays eyes on any settlement. Rather than traveling through the wilderness and finding several houses with a garden as their means of supporting themselves, players can instead see that this landscape has been processed and cultivated to support the town here, which justifies its existence to a better degree. This is all in an effort to create a more immersive game world. Take the towns in Skyrim, for example. Now, I know this is beating a dead horse, and I know there are substantial differences in the scope, scale, and technical resources between these games. If anything, pointing out how the Skyrim model is less realistic due to engine limitations should be looked at as a positive for how these aspects have been improved in later years. In Skyrim, you would come upon a quaint village in the countryside, and if you happened to ask how do they support themselves, you might be directed to a garden with barely enough produce to support one family for a summer. Whereas in a game like Origins, you have to ride through the massive fields of resources on your way into the town. Once in town, you can find enormous amounts of these resources being processed and stored to sell or to be used at a later time. When we look at any town in Origins, the first thing immediately communicated to the player is why they are here. They didn't settle here and then decide to support themselves. Instead, they acted like real people do and found a spot with resources that could allow a settlement to grow. After they found a suitable location, then the town would slowly grow over years of them cultivating the area. If you look on the map screen, you can see how big these farms are. They inhabit a substantial portion of the game's map. I think this is great. It makes this feel less like a game world and more like a real location. Miles of land surrounding cities are inhabited with farmers cultivating that land. This is very distinct from most games where the world goes from a city to the wilderness when you pass through the town's gate. I would much rather games take this kind of approach when designing towns, outposts, cities, forts, and any locations where NPCs are expected to live. I think approaching it from the more grounded historical view of Origins is fundamentally a more immersive approach to creating civilizations for games. Now, I wouldn't fault games for not doing this, especially older games with fewer technological resources. And a lot of games just aren't trying to be as realistic as possible, and that's also fine. But I think in the bigger RPG series that do strive for that level of realism, things like this should be taken into account. And, as we move forward with ever-improving technology, having to ask the question of how people survive in a given place should be answered by the appearance of the town's design. Next, we will cover the population of the people in this world. The overwhelming majority of NPCs in this game cannot be interacted with. Instead, they serve to pad out the cities. I've always held the opinion that this is a positive route for games to take when designing a city. Of course, on the condition that having these large populations of filler NPCs does not detract from having many interesting NPCs for the player to interact with. That being said, the population of this game is incredible. Towns are filled with people. The sheer scale of humans we see is amazing. These cities hold hundreds of NPCs we can see at all times. Fly over the city with Senyu, and there won't be an empty street in sight. Somehow the devs managed to make every city buzzing with life and activity. It's truly amazing. We can see brickmakers, fishermen, farmers, weavers, blacksmiths, fabric dyers, merchants, priests, beggars, guards, caravans, patrols, scholars, butchers, and artisans. While their role in direct relation to the player is very minimal, they create a living environment to surround the actual gameplay at all times. We can see all walks of life through the many different models for these NPCs. Some are garbed in jewelry and fine clothing. Some just have loincloths. We can see merchants, religious members, farmers, laborers, and many more classes of individuals. There is an incredible variety in the appearance of these people, and a good diversity in the NPCs depending on the area you are in. If you decide to walk around Cyrene or another predominantly Greek city, you'll notice that the majority of people are Greek, or other people with paler complexion than the native Egyptians. Whereas if you travel to a more remote city, it is further removed from the population of immigrants and foreigners from across the Mediterranean. Assassin's Creed Origins shows a competent representation in the differing skin tones, depending on how much their specific towns have interacted with others, and this is great. A subtle detail like this helps flesh out the world. If everyone was the same shade of skin, lighter or darker, that wouldn't make sense with the historical accuracy and design of the world. The people who have lived in Egypt for many generations would have a darker complexion, like the main character Bayek. So the areas that are more secluded from the foreigners during this time period would have had smaller differences in their skin colors. Whereas the areas with the most travel and trade with other civilizations, especially along the northern coast like Alexandria and Cyrene, would have the greatest diversity in skin colors. The devs executed these natural differences very well in their game, and it adds to the immersion of the world greatly. Now, aside from the appearance of these individuals, let's look at what they are doing. The question should really be, what are they not doing? Almost any trade you could think would take place in this time period is shown in the game. I've already listed so many of the things we can see people doing in towns, so I don't feel it's necessary to run through it again. Instead, I'd like to look at how many people are doing nothing. The answer is none. Every insignificant NPC in this game is either working a trade, walking around, talking, or enjoying themselves. We simply don't see stagnant NPCs in this game, those being people who walk from point A to point B and are doing nothing for an eternity. We have seen the latter in games since forever, but the devs for Origins gave every NPC in a settlement a detailed script that creates a constant buzz of human life, something very hard to capture, especially on this scale. There are thousands of NPCs in Origins, and they are all busy. Follow anyone around in this game, and you'll see them living a normal life for someone in 50 BC. Throughout most of the clips for this video, you'll be seeing this. It's simply everywhere. You can't escape the coherent, immersive world building from the NPCs. It's amazing. Next, let's take a look at the animals in this game. Not only does Assassin's Creed Origins flesh out the people and history of the world through their architecture, environmental storytelling, and massive human population, but also through the wildlife of the region. If you have the faintest understanding of how people lived before combustion-based technology and machines, then you know how important livestock is. To efficiently sow a field, you'd need some powerful creatures like oxen, donkeys, or horses. To effectively travel from place to place, you'd need animals to carry your belongings, goods, or equipment. We can see donkeys, horses, camels, oxen, and even elephants used for this. To supply enough food for a location, we see chickens and cows in towns. To keep those animals safe, and just because we love them, we also see dogs and cats in many of the towns as well. Outside of these towns, there are animals that pose a threat to humans that also inhabit these areas. Most prominent are lions, crocodiles, hippos, snakes, hyenas, vultures, and leopards. Aside from these is all the other wildlife that lived along the fertile rivers of Egypt. We see flamingos, herons, and many other fish and birds. By simply having a large number of animals, not only domesticated, but wild in their environments, once again makes this world feel so much more alive. We can experience attacks from animals regularly, just like in real life, or at least in real life at this time. A hungry lion or an angry hippo would have been a daily danger for the people living during this time. Living along the rivers would require constant vigilance against hippos and crocodiles. We can see that happening in Assassin's Creed Origins, once again fleshing out the world with grounded, realistic, and historically accurate game design. Now, the final topic we will cover about the towns in Assassin's Creed Origins is the military and religious presence. In 50 BC, both the military and the religious would serve vital roles for the community in which they live. Living during this time meant that the town next door could be your enemies. Having enough soldiers in a location to keep law and order, as well as fend off anyone who might attack, would be vital to a town's ability to grow and prosper. While all the soldiers can be killed in this game, they are not all portrayed as evil bodyguards for an oppressive regime. We can often see guards just patrolling, bothering nobody. Guards used to transport goods from one encampment to another. And we even see guards on duty chatting with civilians. They seem to function more like real people in the world than evil soldiers for the player to kill. Now, if the player travels to a fort in a less populated area, we can see a different side of the military, especially in areas with high bandit or rebel populations. In more dangerous locations, we see the true authoritarian might of the military. The roads around Roman forts are often lined with crucified criminals, rebels, or civilians who incited the wrath of the Romans for one reason or another. This showcases the brutality of the ancient world and their methodologies for keeping the common people in line. Late on your taxes? Well, we've got a cross for that. The amount of forts and outposts in Assassin's Creed Origins not only gives the player many locations for combat and looting, but they make sense within the world. These are not all bandit forts. The world isn't populated by an absurd amount of bandits or raiders or generic bad guys. These are military installations here for the purpose of keeping control over the land. They are often built adjacent to or nearby regular towns and cities. Massive garrisons are often found either inside a city or in a central location in the middle of several towns. This way, if a conflict should arise, soldiers could respond to hostilities anywhere relatively quickly. We can see the bandits in this game as well, but they are by far the minority of hostile NPCs encountered in Origins. Interestingly, the areas with the highest bandit population are also the ones with the highest population of proper military forces. Because where there is lawlessness, the military is trying to establish order. Rather than having guards only in the cities and forts, we can actually see them combating the rebels and the bandits alike. In areas like the isolated desert, we can see a constant battle for land between the heavy military presence here and the large population of rebel fighters. In the areas near Cyrene with the highest bandit populations, we also find the most Roman forts and the most Roman patrols engaging with these bandits. It makes sense. It adds combat encounters for the player, which are fun, and it tells us a story about the people and what they are doing here. Once again, it's great environmental storytelling. The next aspect we can see lots of in the cities is the religious devotion. There are shrines, statues, altars, and symbols for the Egyptian gods everywhere. If you haven't yet, you should look into the Egyptian pantheon. I think it blows the Greek and Norse pantheons out of the water, but that's just me. All over these cities, we can find shrines with people praying. Here we see a good example of the Egyptians' architectural skills. Most of the massive, impressive statues are from the Old Kingdom, but they are Egyptian nonetheless. In these shrines and statues, we can see excellent craftsmanship. All over the cities, we can find shrines with people praying. We can see offerings of fresh fruit and incense. Beads, trinkets, and sacrifices are laid before the statue of the gods. Religion was such a big part of daily life for the Egyptians, and we see that portrayed excellently here. Especially in a time when people lived so close to death, and life or death was much more of a daily obstacle than it is now, having a strong religious devotion would have been vital for people's morale and just keeping the civilization going. There wasn't a lot of room for nihilism when a lion could come and eat you, or an army could just march on your land and make you all slaves. If we travel to the temples, we can see the incredible beauty and devotion the Egyptians poured into their faith. Priests and priestesses tend to the temples and often preach to the people outside. We can see offerings of various animals to the gods, heaps of riches and expensive trinkets laid before the statues as offerings. Rich and poor alike are seen kneeling down to their gods to pay homage or ask for aid. Another great example is in the city of Crocodilopolis, where crocodiles are considered holy and sacred because of the Egyptian crocodile god Sobek. We can see them keep crocodiles in the palace in large pools in order to worship their god. The cities of Assassin's Creed Origins are one of its best elements. They are designed like actual cities. We can see different districts in each city. The harbors are filled with trade and ships. The markets are bustling with life and commerce. The temples are full of devout people making offerings and holding ceremonies. The slums are packed with craftsmen and laborers. The garrisons are heavily patrolled and manned. From a gameplay standpoint, cities only offer quest givers, blacksmiths, weavers, and stables for the player to interact with. Instead of being sparsely inhabited and streamlined for gameplay functionality, the devs created entire cities to host these few locations of use to the player. They went above and beyond to recreate what life in the ancient world would have looked like. We see the towns operate based on where they are located geographically. If it's a coastal town, they are going to be filled with docks, fishermen, and naval trade. If the town is inland, then we see them relying on agriculture, artisans, and livestock. The town is located near a quarry? Well, we can see the majority of the people here are dedicated to brickmaking and masonry. Town in a swamp? Well, we can see they hunt crocodiles and fish. People are only inhabiting areas with resources that can support a livelihood. People don't just exist at point A because the story or quest needs people in a location. The game world itself follows a correlation between resource acquisition and the human population, just like real-world civilizations. Now, these places are all based on actual societies and towns in an approximate range of where they were in actual history. However, it should be obvious that we don't actually know what Memphis looked like thousands of years ago. The game designers had to look at archaeological evidence and pair it with a grounded understanding of how their societies would support themselves. Putting these together, they created excellent depictions that are believable and practical. We have seen historical cities in games before. A town based on a real place in history does not then automatically create a believable location. Nor does a fictional location automatically veto the believability of a game location. In the instance of Assassin's Creed Origins, the developers deserve high praise for creating such immersive locations. It might sound like I'm just gushing over the towns in many words, and to an extent I am, but I really don't want the depth and scale of these towns to go underappreciated, because they excel on so many more levels than just making a good video game city. If other devs were able to translate this format into other worlds and games, I think it would be a great improvement for gaming as a whole. The focus on how and why these people are where they are is such an important facet of creating a world within a video game. By answering these questions so well in the design of the world, without having to spell it out for the player, is the magnum opus of environmental storytelling. I'd love to see this level of effort and dedication in world design in every franchise I play. I hope moving forward with newer games, the example of Assassin's Creed Origins is not just lost or discredited as just the Ubisoft formula. This game stands above the other faux RPGs that came after it. It stands separate from the installments that came before it. And to anyone who hasn't yet, I highly recommend you play Assassin's Creed Origins. The gameplay itself is simple yet very fun. It's basically Skyrim gameplay. Get a quest, run to a place, kill some people, get a thing. Over and over. The story is good, but the campaign isn't its greatest strength. The world in which it takes place is its highest achievement, and a reason to play the game all on its own. I hope that you will give the game a try. And aside from that, I hope you've seen what a game can achieve with its environmental storytelling. Personally, I hold all post-2017 games to the world design of Origins. I'd like to see more games striving for this level of effort in their worlds. Until next time, farewell.